He was called the Lord of the Skies, a name that struck fear from Colombia to California. Amado Carrillo Fuentes wasn't just another drug lord. He turned the Juarez cartel into a global trafficking empire by flying tons of cocaine in commercial jets, raking in billions while staying one step ahead of law enforcement. Quiet, calculating, and invisible, he built an empire above the clouds and vanished as mysteriously as he rose. This is the true story of the man who changed the rules of the drug game forever. Subscribe for more untold crime stories that history forgot. Amado Carrillo Fuentes was born into a world where crime was more than a temptation, it was a family business. Raised in Sinaloa, a region known as the cradle of Mexico's drug trade, he came from a powerful family that already had strong connections to some of the most notorious criminal organizations of the time. His uncle, Ernesto Don Neto Fonseca Carrillo, wasn't just involved, he was a heavyweight in the Guadalajara cartel, one of the original drug empires that shaped the future of organized crime in Mexico. Amado grew up watching how power moved, how respect was earned, and most of all, how silence and loyalty meant everything in the underworld. It didn't take long for him to step onto that path himself. In his early years, Amado kept a low profile. He didn't make waves or attract attention, but he paid close attention to how things worked. His first jobs were relatively small compared to what was ahead of him. He helped move product, kept records, and acted as a liaison between different parts of the network. His intelligence and calm nature helped him stand out. He wasn't the type to shoot his way to the top. Instead, he built relationships, studied logistics, and positioned himself as someone who could get things done without drama. Over time, those traits made him invaluable. By the time the Mexican government cracked down on the Guadalajara cartel in the late 1980s, the drug world was shifting. With Don Neto behind bars and other cartel leaders being hunted down or killed, there was a vacuum forming. New power centers were emerging, and Amado saw an opportunity. He moved over to the Juarez cartel, one of the many splinter groups that came out of Guadalajara's collapse. At first, he worked under Rafael Aguilar Guajardo, a flashy and ambitious leader who had control of key smuggling routes into the United States. Amado served as his second-in-command, quietly learning the ins and outs of Juarez operations. Aguilar was bold and increasingly reckless, flaunting his wealth and drawing attention from both the press and law enforcement. Amado, on the other hand, kept a much lower profile. He understood that power wasn't just about money. It was about staying alive and staying in control. As Aguilar made enemies and lost favor, Amado began to lay the groundwork to take over. In 1993, that opportunity came. Aguilar was assassinated in Cancun, and most people believe Amado was behind it. Whether he pulled the trigger or not, he stepped into the leadership vacuum immediately and took control of the Juarez cartel without resistance. From that moment, Amado started reshaping the organization into something far bigger and more efficient. He didn't want to be just another kingpin. He wanted to dominate the skies, the borders, the ports, every point where drugs passed through. He understood that the real game wasn't just about brute force. It was about scaled transport and reliability. That's when he began to build what would become his trademark, a private air force. Unlike many traffickers who moved cocaine by land or sea, Amado believed the fastest and most efficient way to move drugs was by air. He acquired a fleet of jets, including commercial airliners like Boeing 727s, and converted them into drug freighters. These planes flew directly from Colombia into Mexican territory packed with tons of cocaine. It was a bold strategy and one that changed everything. He didn't just rent planes, he bought them. He didn't rely on corrupt customs agents, he created airstrips in remote areas where no one would notice a thing. His pilots were loyal, trained, and paid well. The air fleet gave him speed scale and, most importantly, control. That's how he earned the nickname El Señor de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies. Amado's success was rooted in his ability to stay invisible. While other drug lords were obsessed with fame and flash, he avoided the spotlight. He didn't make many public appearances, didn't give interviews, and didn't attract the same media attention that guys like Pablo Escobar did. But behind the scenes, his power was growing faster than anyone imagined. He strengthened ties with Colombian cartels, especially the Cali cartel, which was eager to find reliable partners after the fall of Escobar. Amado offered them what they needed most: fast, safe, and massive transportation into the U.S. market. By the early 1990s, he had built a drug empire that was more sophisticated than anything Mexico had seen before. He used banks, shell companies, and government contacts to launder money and protect his operations. He spread his influence across police forces and political offices, ensuring that his shipments could pass through borders and airports without a problem. He wasn't just moving drugs, he was running a billion-dollar business with the precision of a global corporation. Despite all this, Amado never lost sight of the basics. Loyalty mattered. Mistakes weren't tolerated. Betrayal was answered swiftly and without mercy. He ran his cartel like a machine, and people knew that crossing him meant the end. That fear, combined with the respect he commanded, kept his inner circle tight and his rivals in check. As the years went by, more and more shipments passed through his network and the profits piled up. He became a ghost, untouchable, unseen, and growing more powerful with every successful flight. At this point, law enforcement in both Mexico and the United States knew his name, but they couldn't touch him. He moved too fast, covered his tracks too well, and had too many people on his payroll. While other traffickers were getting arrested or killed, Amado only seemed to rise higher. The Lord of the Skies had built his kingdom in the clouds, and for now, no one could reach him. Amado Carrillo Fuentes entered the height of his power with the kind of calm confidence that only a man who owned the skies could have. After taking over the Juarez cartel, he wasted no time in turning it into one of the most efficient and powerful drug trafficking organizations on the continent. The combination of Colombian supply, American demand, and Mexican logistics made for the perfect storm, and Amado sat right in the center of it all. His air fleet kept expanding. By the mid-1990s, it was estimated that he operated dozens of aircraft, many of them former commercial jets, stripped down and rebuilt to carry thousands of pounds of cocaine at a time. These weren't hidden in backwoods fields either. Amado used legitimate hangars, corrupt airport staff, and well-placed bribes to move his cargo undetected. With the skies under his control, he could move more product faster than any other cartel. His relationships with the Colombian suppliers were solid. The Cali cartel, which had risen after the fall of Escobar, relied heavily on him to get their cocaine into the U.S. through a network of air routes that spanned from South America to northern Mexico and then overland into the U.S. Amado ran a smooth, unbroken chain of distribution. What set him apart was not just the volume, but the precision. Flights landed on schedule, shipments arrived intact, and profits flowed like never before. There were mistakes, of course. No operation that size runs perfectly, but Amado had contingencies for everything. If a pilot failed, another was ready. If a route was exposed, he simply switched it. While his planes were in the air, his money was being washed clean on the ground. Amado invested heavily in real estate hotels, construction and front companies. Some of his properties were lavish estates, others were low-profile commercial assets. He had homes across Mexico, including a sprawling mansion in Hermosillo and another in the exclusive district of Lomas de Chapultepec in Mexico City. These homes weren't just symbols of wealth. They were secure meeting spots, heavily guarded bunkers where no outsider got in without approval. He rarely stayed in one place too long. He rotated, constantly protected by an army of bodyguards and a wall of bribes that extended from street cops to high-ranking officials. His influence in Mexican law enforcement and politics was staggering. Officers who investigated him were reassigned, intimidated, or paid off. Evidence disappeared, cases were dropped, and judges turned blind eyes. Even though the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration was sharing intelligence with their Mexican counterparts, nothing stuck. Amado always seemed to be one step ahead. He wasn't reckless like many cartel leaders. He didn't pick fights he couldn't win, and he never mistook fame for strength. That's why, even though his name was whispered in corridors of power, few knew what he looked like. He was a shadow figure, and that suited him perfectly. But as his wealth and power grew, so did the pressure. The U.S. placed him high on their list of most wanted traffickers, and Mexican authorities, under intense international scrutiny, began to take real steps to hunt him down. Amado knew his days of moving freely were numbered. He tightened his inner circle even more, distancing himself from those he didn't fully trust. He began traveling with multiple look-alikes and fake passports. He upgraded his communication system, switching regularly between phones and safe houses. He started grooming successors within the Juarez cartel, quietly training a few trusted men to step in if anything happened to him. But even with all the precautions, Amado was aware of one problem: he couldn't fix his face. His identity had finally caught up with him. Pictures were starting to circulate. Law enforcement had begun putting the pieces together. He couldn't walk through airports anymore, couldn't attend family gatherings, couldn't visit his properties without risking arrest or worse. So in 1997, he made a decision that would become one of the most infamous moves in cartel history. He arranged for extensive plastic surgery in Mexico City to alter his appearance and buy himself more time on the run. This wasn't a simple nose job or scar removal. Amado planned a full transformation. Rumors say he was preparing to disappear entirely, change his name, and start a new life somewhere far from Mexico. The surgery was supposed to take several hours and involve multiple procedures. He paid top dollar to keep everything quiet, choosing a private hospital and bringing in highly skilled surgeons. The operation began in July 1997, and for a few hours everything seemed to be going according to plan. But something went wrong. According to official reports, Amado died on the operating table due to complications from a combination of medications used during the surgery. Some say it was the anesthesia. Others say it was his heart giving out under the strain. Either way, the Lord of the Skies was gone. The fallout was immediate. 2 of the doctors who performed the surgery were later found dead, their bodies stuffed into barrels of cement. A clear message from someone high up. The killings sparked widespread speculation. Many believed the murders were ordered by the Juarez cartel to silence the doctors, while others claimed it was Amado himself who had ordered them before faking his death. Conspiracy theories began swirling. Some people in the drug world refused to believe he was really dead. There were no clear photos of his corpse, no open casket funeral, and too many convenient coincidences. People whispered that Amado had fled to Argentina or Chile, living out his days under a new identity, his billions safely hidden away. But officially, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was pronounced dead. He was buried under tight security with few mourners and even fewer answers. The man who ruled the skies had fallen to earth not in a gunfight or a DEA raid, but on an operating table in a luxury hospital. His death sent shockwaves through the drug world not just because of how sudden it was, but because of what it meant for the future. The Juarez cartel lost its head, and rivals immediately began circling like vultures. The organization that once flew higher than any other cartel was now left in chaos, and in the silence that followed, his legend only grew. After Amado Carrillo Fuentes' sudden death in 1997, the drug world was left in a haze of confusion, disbelief, and brutal calculation. In the power vacuum that followed, everyone with even a sliver of ambition tried to grab a piece of what he had built. His funeral was quiet, heavily guarded, and carried out with as little attention as possible. But even as his body was lowered into the ground, rumors kept spreading that he wasn't really dead. Some said the body was a double. Others claimed that the whole surgery story was a smokescreen, and that Amado had paid his way into a new life with a new face somewhere in South America. No matter what people believed, one thing was certain: his death left a storm behind. The Juarez cartel, once the most streamlined and well-funded trafficking machine in Mexico, began to fracture. Amado had ruled through a combination of disciplined vision and absolute control. Without him, there was no clear successor powerful enough to keep everything together. Several of his lieutenants and allies tried to fill the void. One of the most prominent was Vicente Carrillo Fuentes Amado's younger brother, who tried to keep the cartel unified and operational. Vicente was intelligent and dangerous, but he didn't inspire the same fear or loyalty that Amado had. Infighting broke out as rival factions within the organization tried to assert dominance. What had been a carefully run empire started splintering into smaller, more violent groups. This internal chaos didn't go unnoticed. Other cartels, particularly the Sinaloa cartel under Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, saw an opportunity to move in on Juarez territory. Turf wars erupted along key smuggling routes. The border city of Ciudad Juarez, once the stronghold of Amado's empire, became one of the most dangerous places in the world. Bodies started piling up in the streets. Shootouts happened in broad daylight. Families disappeared overnight. The violence that followed Amado's death was a stark contrast to the controlled efficiency of his reign. With no single leader holding the strings, the drug war entered a new and bloodier phase. While the cartel descended into chaos, authorities in Mexico and the United States focused on what Amado had left behind. His assets, many of which were cleverly laundered through front companies, real estate, and offshore accounts, became the target of massive investigations. Properties worth millions were seized. Bank accounts were frozen. But it became clear that much of his fortune had vanished. Experts estimate he left behind billions, yet only a fraction of it was ever found. The rest disappeared into the financial shadows, protected by layers of corruption, false names, and loyal handlers who never spoke a word. Even in death, Amado had outmaneuvered the system. His legend grew stronger as the years passed. Stories of how he transformed the drug business became lore in the underworld. He was talked about in hushed tones, not just as a trafficker but as a strategist, a man who ran his cartel like a multinational company. Unlike the reckless kingpins who came before or after, Amado never sought to be a celebrity. He didn't pose with gold-plated guns or throw wild parties for the press. His strength was in his invisibility. That made him harder to catch, but it also made him harder to forget. For every gangster that bragged about knowing him, there were 10 who never even laid eyes on the man. In pop culture, Amado became a ghostly figure. TV shows, books, and documentaries tried to piece together his story. He was often portrayed as a cold genius, someone who avoided violence when possible, but responded with total ruthlessness when crossed. In reality, his world was full of contradictions. He was known to care deeply for his family, even as he orchestrated billion-dollar deals that destroyed countless lives through addiction and violence. He gave generous donations to churches and charities while ordering hits on rivals and traitors. People who knew him say he had a calm voice, and rarely raised it even when discussing life or death decisions. As the Mexican drug war escalated through the 2000s and 2010s, many began to look back on Amado's era with a strange kind of nostalgia. It wasn't because his time was peaceful, it wasn't, but because the chaos that followed him was so much worse. He represented a version of the drug trade that in hindsight looked almost professional. The cartels that rose after him became more fragmented, more unpredictable, and often more brutal. Kidnappings, torture, and mass killings became routine. In contrast, Amado's rule, though rooted in corruption and crime, had been relatively quiet. He preferred bribes to bloodshed, and, in the twisted logic of cartel history that made him seem almost civilized. By the time his brother Vicente was arrested in 2014, the Juarez cartel had been reduced to a shell of its former self. Other players dominated the scene. The Sinaloa cartel took over large parts of the border routes, and newer organizations like the Jalisco New Generation cartel began carving out their own empires. But traces of Amado's methods could still be seen, especially in the way modern cartels embraced logistics, technology, and international partnerships. He had set the blueprint, and even though his organization crumbled, his influence lived on in every plane tunnel and convoy that carried drugs northward. There are still those who believe Amado never died. From time to time, rumors flare up: a blurry photo in Argentina, a whispered sighting in Chile, a bank transaction linked to one of his old aliases. Nothing ever comes of it, but the story refuses to die. Whether it's myth or reality, the idea that the Lord of the Skies escaped justice has become part of his legend. He remains one of the most enigmatic figures in cartel history, a man who built a kingdom above the clouds and vanished before the world could catch him. In the end, Amado Carrillo Fuentes left behind more than a drug empire. He left behind a model of silent power, strategic thinking, and ruthless efficiency that changed the rules of the game. And while newer kingpins have come and gone, few have matched his reach, his wealth, or his ability to disappear when it mattered most. The skies he once ruled are still full of planes, but none of them fly with the same shadow as his did. Amado Carrillo Fuentes died or disappeared as one of the richest and most elusive drug lords in history. His empire collapsed, his rivals circled, and yet his legend kept growing. He didn't die in a shootout or prison, but on an operating table, leaving behind questions that still echo decades later. Did he really die? Or did the Lord of the Skies take one final flight into the unknown? If you enjoyed this story, hit like and subscribe for more deep dives into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld.